Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for being with us for the launch of the new book by one of our most admired thinkers, who's also an extraordinarily informed, sensitive, and passionate writer, teacher, and human rights worker. Harsh Mander's Looking Away is a book of courage and compassion, and I doubt we'll read a more important book about and for the times that we live in. It shows us with reason and unflinching conviction the face of India that we prefer not to see or cannot bear to. The enormous and sometimes numbing inequality and injustice that we allow all around us, the indifference and active neglect, the prejudice, the bias, the intolerance. This isn't only a rigorous examination of the many ways in which the state continues to wound the vulnerable and the marginalized, especially since India's, well, I would call it an unthinking allegiance to the market, which began in the 1990s, and more recently the rise of majoritarian and divisive politics. It is also an indictment of the country's vast middle class that accepts chauvinism and extreme callousness as an acceptable price to pay for economic progress, and is often blind to the fact that our social indices are worse than those of the world's poorest nations. It's truly been a privilege to publish this brave and monumental book. It was, in fact, among the first that Speaking Tiger acquired, and for that we are grateful to Harsh, grateful that he trusted us with it, and grateful also for his friendship. We're grateful too to our distinguished panelists this evening, Mark Tully, Zoya Hassan, Siddharth Varadarajan, and Urvashi Butalia, who has kindly agreed to moderate the discussion. I'm going to hand it over to you, Urvashi.
I want to start by telling you two stories which have a certain kind of resonance with Harsh's book. And the first of these stories takes place in an urban village in Delhi called Shahpur Jat, where I have my office, and where until some time ago on Saturday evenings around 5 o'clock, and indeed on all evenings around 5 or 6 o'clock, sabziwalas and theriwalas and others would gather in one of the lanes to have a village market where you could buy everything reasonably cheap, and where the entire village would come out in the evening. And the village is also quite heavily populated by a whole lot of Bangladeshi sweat labor who work on all those bling clothes that you are able to buy at huge expense in boutiques across Delhi and elsewhere. So there was also a fish market. And one day I was shopping there after office when a large SUV drove up trying to push its way through the market. And there was a man with a redi, and he was actually weighing something, and he was half in front of the SUV because people were on the road, in the middle, at the sides. And the man honked, the driver of the SUV was a young Sardar. And the theriwala did not move. Very important to get the deal over with. And this young man got out of his car and took the tarazu, and he hit it so that the brass bowl, which is on the scales, fell down. And he picked up the stone and started to hit this man with it. And everybody was completely shocked for a moment, and then people rushed towards him, at which point he hopped into his car, the road cleared, and he drove off. After that day, that market did not happen there in that lane for a very, very long time. It's only now slowly started inching back. When I was reading Harsh's book, I was powerfully reminded of this incident because it's the kind of thing that Harsh talks about so eloquently. The people in that market are the kind of people that Harsh is deeply concerned about. And it's just had so many resonances for me when I was reading the book. The second story is a very different story. Harsh's book takes the 2014 election as a very important point in India as the culmination and the beginning of many things, the kind of inequalities he traces, the kind of anti-minoritism he traces, and a whole host of other things. And I have just recently been reading a book called Rearming Hinduism, by a man called Vamsi Jaluri. I don't know how many of you have heard of this gentleman. He is a teacher of media studies at the University of California. And the book takes the 2014 election as the watershed point at which Hindus in India and across the world, 1 billion of us, as he says, have begun to realize that this is the moment when we must reclaim all the lost territory and all the lost pride and all the lost everything that we have. And it is a call to battle, to fight this battle, the effects of which Harsh describes so well in his book. For those of you who have not read Harsh's book, the span is really, really wide, and he goes from the personal to the much, much broader, much larger reality with effortless ease, talks about certain basic things, indifference, inequality, a sense of entitlement on the part of the rich, and talks about things ranging from bonded labor to education, to child labor, to domestic work, to minoritism, to communalism, and a whole range of other things, which is why Ravi called it monumental. And the feminist in me was waiting for Ravi to use the word seminal so I could protest about it. But luckily he didn't, he called it monumental. So I want to start this discussion really by asking Harsh, who is a prolific writer for whom the issues in this book are not new, but bringing them together in the way you have, Harsh, what did it do to you? And how did you begin to think of it? And why did you think of this monumental work?
Thank you, Urvashi. It actually started in my mind as a small essay. Essay which I wrote, and then I realized that there was more and more to say. You know, the subjects that I've addressed through much of my life's work is about inequality, it is about prejudice, it is about the failures of the state. But that is not really, although inequality and prejudice are mentioned in the title, the book is not, to my mind, so much about inequality and prejudice as it is about the legitimization, the normalization, the normative frameworks in which it is considered okay. And I think that is really what has driven this book, the sense of that inequality, not just the facts of inequality, but the sense, the social common sense among the middle class that this is either inevitable or even legitimate, and I think that worries. And the changes that I've seen from my childhood, which was perhaps a more idealistic time, where there was inequality, there was privilege, but people, there was a certain restraint in the way that you chose to live your lives, where prejudice was certainly in people's hearts, but is not something that you would display with the kind of ease that you did. There's also a strange moral inversion in our political discourse today, where it is the privileged people who feel somehow persecuted by the poor rather than the other way around. And Modi's politics to me represents a lot of the culmination of this idea that somehow middle class people, hardworking, honest, are being taxed to distribute freebies to the poor. This kind of discourse, and strangely also where it is the majority community which is feeling persecuted by the minority. So this book is really more about what's going on in our hearts and minds and how we justify the inequalities. And finally, questioning how can we reclaim the idea of a just and caring state. And I recognize, and I say so in my book, that most of my life, when I've seen an injustice, I've thought about how the state should address it. So what should happen in law and policy to make it change? But what is new in my thinking, and I think that's what I wanted to share, was that the recognition that a just and caring state can only be located and is possible only in a just and caring society. And so the importance of public compassion, and I worry even, with the cover of the book and the initial pages, it's not a book written to shock you. It's really about saying that we have to find again public compassion in our discourse, in our politics, in the way we conduct our lives, in the way we conduct, in the way we raise our children. And the ideas of compassion to me is solidarity. It is, Noam Chomsky somewhere has said that the idea of social protection is basically the idea that we should take care of each other. And I find that that's really what this book is finally about. But he adds that this idea that we should take care of each other, we're living in times where this is seen as an extremely dangerous and subversive idea, which must be crushed at all costs. And I think that profoundly, that is what I wanted to address, to talk about love and compassion as something that we need to find again within our hearts, in the way we conduct our lives, in the way we raise our children, in our social relationships, in our expectations from the state, in the way we conduct our politics. And that's why the book came about.
But in the research that you did and in the writing of it, did you actually find the hope and this compassion and the grace that you were seeking? And if so, where did you find it?
See, I write, but much of everything that I've written in this book is really arises from work that I engage in. And truly, I mean, it might sound a little cliched and to say this, but I have really found most of what I talk about in the lives of working class people that I have the privilege of working with. I do find an instinctive sense of caring for each other. I do find the kinds of solidarity that I speak about. And therefore, towards the end of the book, I actually there's a whole series, Learning From. And I've had a series of learning froms where I want to say that, how do people live compassion and courage in their lives? So I've talked about Ishrat Jahan's mother, I've talked about Zakia Jafri, whom we know, but I've also talked about people we don't know. I've talked about working class young men and women who who lost everything in Gujarat and how they're still able to find compassion and work for peace. Talked about somebody I read about in the US whose their daughter was killed by her boyfriend who was 19 years old. And finally, the parents of that girl were the ones who petitioned the court not to give the death penalty to the boy. So there's a whole range of people that one learned from, and the second last chapter is really about learning from those who have nothing.
Zoya, let me turn to you. One of the phrases that Harsh constantly uses in the book is about the almost normalization or naturalization of inequality, of our acceptance of poverty. It's not as if we are not aware that it's around, but we have normalized it into our lives. So we don't act, we don't notice. You've thought a lot, worked a lot on, especially on the issue of inequality. What are your thoughts on what Harsh is saying in his book on this particular issue?
I said this book is not really concerned about facts of inequality or about so much about the analysis of inequality, but I do think that there's one fact which is worth mentioning, and that is that, and I say this because Harsh makes the point somewhere in the beginning that the inequality that you find in India and the indifference towards inequality that you find in India is not unique to India. And he says that when he has talked to activists from other countries, such as Brazil or Mexico, they often point out to him that you could replace India with Brazil or Mexico. I think here I would tend to differ with Harsh, because I think there's one fact that I might just point out, that I think, as I just said, that even among countries exhibiting a rapid rise in wealth inequality, I think India stands out. And the increase in wealth inequality in India between 2000 and 2014 has been phenomenal. The share, and I think this is worth noting, that the share of the top 1% in the total wealth of households has increased from 36.80% in 2000 to a phenomenal 49% in 2014. Now, this increase in the concentration of wealth and therefore inequality is much greater in India than the usual suspect, which is the United States in this case. So I think we would do well to note that I think the rapid rise of inequality in India is very, very significant. Now, to your point, and I think Harsh's book is significant precisely because he is arguing, and here again I think I might slightly differ with him. I think he's suggesting that the problem really is societal. It has to do with the normative framework. It has to do with the shift in thinking, particularly of the middle classes, and he compares the time, let's say, when he was growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, the kind of middle class thinking or even elite thinking then, and elite and middle class thinking today. Now, it is true that I think there is a very significant shift in the thinking of the middle classes, and he's absolutely right in suggesting that middle classes to some extent are responsible. But I think the point really is whether we can really explain this phenomenal inequality in India. I was making the point that, yes, there is this issue of normalization, but I'm wondering whether we can really explain the issue of normalization simply through a normative framework. Now, of course, I mean, the normative framework and the normative system is important, but I think attitudes in themselves and change in attitudes of the middle classes in themselves, I think does not really explain inequalities which are characterized by such high levels of absolute wealth and equally high levels of poverty or very entrenched poverty. And here I think I would say that while I greatly admire this book and the kind of information, the experience, and the compassion and the eloquence that he brings, but I do think that there are certain other reasons which would explain this. And there is, after all, a self-interest. It's not a question of attitudes. It's a question of self-interest of the middle classes. It's a question of the self-interest of the elite. But at the same time, I think the point that Harsh is making, and I'll close with that, and that is that if we really look at, let's say, 20th century history, and if we look at the history of the second half of the 20th century, countries which have succeeded in dealing with poverty or in reducing inequality are countries which have actually focused on state-led development and state strategies of development. That, I think there, Harsh is absolutely right, that we have to somehow bring back the focus on the state. But as to your question about normalization, I think it has to be, we can't really focus only, I would say we of course must focus, and that is the strength of this book, is that it shines the light on the middle classes. And I think it it provides a much needed critique of the middle classes. Because I think, let's face it, there's been such a celebration of the middle class in India, and there's a celebration of India's middle class abroad. I mean, every country that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting, what is this all about? They're all looking at the Indian market, and they're looking at this large middle class, and they are, along with India, celebrating that middle class. So I think he's done very well to have, critiqued that.
Mark, I want to turn to you a little bit. A long time back, I remember having a conversation with you where you were incensed, and quite rightly so, at what you saw as the huge level of entitlement that Delhi's middle class felt about access to public spaces, about driving on the roads, about all sorts of things. And in many ways, the naturalization and normalization of inequality and this wide social acceptance to poverty and all of that, the sense of entitlement of the rich and the middle classes is the flip side of that. Do you want to say a little bit about that, and also what your general reaction to this book is?
Yeah.
Yes, I do think, and I agree with Harsh, that part of the problem is, putting it slightly different to you, it's a very simple thing to say, really, but that we all live with this poverty. We have got used to it, basically. We accept it almost as a fact of life. And you know, one thing which really, I mean, Harsh said he didn't intend to shock in his book, but he did shock me. He shocked me about my own lack of knowledge, basically, about what he pointed out in his first section. And in particular, he said that there had been a woman who'd been living under a canvas, I think it was, in Nizamuddin for many years. And I've lived in Nizamuddin for many years, and I can't remember having seen that woman once. And so I do think that it's just, in a way, many people, without thinking, just accept what they see as a fact of life. The other thing I would like to say, just one other thing really, is that I do agree with Harsh, of course, that if you had a compassionate society, then you would have compassion for those who are suffering and everything. But I think it's important to realize that we live in what I might call a political and economic climate which is totally lacking in compassion, where, as I see it, the whole importance is on the individual and the whole ambition is individual gratification. And therefore, it is not surprising that the Indian middle class are affected by that, just as middle classes everywhere are.
But where do you think we've lost it? Because from what Harsh traces in his book, when he's talking about his own childhood, he's talking of a very different world where it's not that inequality is absent, but it is that there seems to be much more caring, there seems to be much more of a sense of community, there seems to be much more of a sense of values, something that's important. There's no profligate spending of money, there's no, I mean, no, Anil Ambani 27-floor house abandoned because of Vastu or whatever it is. None of that. Even the rich were somewhat circumspect the time. So where do you think, you as somebody who's been watching this country for a long time, living here, so where do you think that's gone?
Well, I mean, I would agree with Harsh about what he says about his childhood, and the same could be said about my childhood, my time in university. But you see, I don't think this is just special to India. I think it is something which has come everywhere with this particular form of neoliberal economics and neoliberal politics that go with it. I think this is not, of course, the sole cause of this, but this is a very fundamental aspect of it. Because if you just take the very fact that consumerism is essential to this whole project, and consumerism simply does not generate the sort of talking about. So that's where I think a very important aspect of this whole problem.
Siddharth, your take on this, your thoughts also on the issue that Zoya was raising about state and society, and Harsh's take that socially we have become unwilling, inept, just not unthinking about exercising compassion or caring but what would you say about that? What's your take?
Thanks. Well, first up, I want to add my voice to the chorus of praise for Harsh's book. I think this is it's a marvelous book. It's a difficult book, but it's a book that really deserves a very wide audience. And I applaud Speaking Tiger for bringing it out. I'll tell a little bit of an inside story about which will convey the kind of resistance that there is to some of the issues that the book raises. When I took over as editor of Hindu a couple of years ago, within the first couple of weeks, Harsh's column is an important part of the Sunday magazine. And a senior colleague, journalistic colleague, came up to me and says, you know, because word had got around that I was keen to revamp the paper in various ways, and this person said, you know, we need to redo the magazine. It's very boring. It's too preachy. And so I said, well, what are you suggesting? And he says, shouldn't we change all our columnists? So I said, well, Harsh is very popular. And he said, no, only the converted read it. So I said, okay, I called the internet guy and I said, do you have a way of measuring, you know, what gets read? And the chap says, yeah, we have all the data. So I said, fine, let's not look at the past. It was a Wednesday or Thursday. I said, let's see what he writes in the coming Sunday. And then we'll have a discussion on that. And the piece that Harsh wrote, I think it was the How to Live on 32 Rupees a Day, that piece, it like burst all the charts. And all his pieces are very widely read, but that piece in particular about these lads who, in order to disprove or to make fun of the Manmohan Singh government's absurd poverty line, did a social experiment where they said, okay, let's try to live on this poverty line and see where that takes us. And I printed out the data to my colleague and I said, look, you know, you may feel it's boring, but this is it, you know. And so then the person conceded that he was wrong. And Harsh continued to be a very valued part of the paper, as he is in every place that he writes. So there is resistance. There is, people, don't always recognize the value of this, just as we, I should say, learn to avert our gaze from things that you get used to or you are unpleasant. People don't necessarily want to read about, unpleasant things, but they're vital and they have to be written about, they have to be read, they have to be discussed. But I feel that lamentation about the state of the middle class takes us only so far. I'm interested personally in the intersection of middle class attitudes, which are themselves dynamic and the product of circumstance, political economy, the issues that you raised, Zoya, but also the political process. In his first section, Harsh raises this problem that Akhil Gupta, the sociologist, raises, when he says, why is it in a country where the poor are the overwhelming majority, why is it that the state or those who control the state don't feel the need to address issues of hunger or mass deprivation or sanitation in any serious way? And I would like to, the obverse or the flip side of that question is why, despite failing to address the basic concerns of the majority of the people and poor people, why is it that these leaders and these parties get elected? So what is it about, so is it that people are ignorant, the massive voters? That may be a comforting way to explain it. Or is there something about the way in which the political process functions? Candidate selection, role of money power, perhaps the failure of social movements which otherwise have a lot of support to transform themselves into viable politics, and we only have the sorry spectacle of AAP to, in a way, educate us about this. But the ease with which these parties, the suited-booted parties, and I don't think the BJP is the only suited-booted party, the ease with which these parties are able to grab control of the Indian state, legitimize it through elections, and do nothing at all for the constituents who elect them, and then get re-elected in one way or the other, to my mind is a far more challenging problem than the middle class, figuring out how to improve. If I were to zero in on one issue, which sends the middle class in this negative direction, it was a failure in the 60s to have a common schooling system. The Kothari Commission's idea of having neighborhood schools where rich and poor in a given neighborhood go to the same school would have, I think, brought about a different kind of middle class, perhaps. I think it would have brought about a different kind of working class. It would have led to a better educated, the middle class. I think somewhere, Harsh, you refer to Arundhati's piece about the secession, exactly. The middle class seceding from the government school system essentially ensured that public education would never take off in the way that it needed to. And unfortunately, over the years, I feel if the middle class lost contact with the urban working classes by failing to be part of a common education system, I feel over the years the increasing ghettoized mindset, particularly of many middle class Hindus, is leading to other kinds of pathologies, which Harsh's second section addresses, and it's again something that I wish would be very widely read and discussed. Because this is one thing that, the example you gave about the Rediwala, I'm fairly certain that the average middle class person would instantly react in a negative, would say, what the hell is this brazen, this SUV guy, usko pakdo. We're very quick to recognize the injustice in these acts of, assertion of wealth-related, power in this way. But when confronted with examples of communal injustice, I don't see people responding with the same alacrity, the same degree of empathy. You have to explain things, and then yes, maybe somebody understands the point. I've often had discussions about, the problem of housing. You were mentioning this novel that you're just going to bring out. And, people, the first reaction is, no, but Muslims also have their own housing. I'm saying people are always looking to make excuses rather than to confront the reality of, prejudice in our daily lives.
Mark, do you want to add something before I ask Harsh to?
No, not really, except I'd just like to make one different point, which is that I was a little worried as I read Harsh's book that it was all negative. But in fact, I was very happy to find it was not all negative, and that whilst we go on and on talking about what has gone wrong, Harsh does emphasize that an awful lot has gone right. And I think that's a very, very important point indeed. The only other thing which I would like to add is that from my experience of Britain, I don't see actually that the middle class in Britain has much sympathy for those below it myself. I think there is much, what has happened is that there is more of a confluence, more and more people have come into the middle class. But I really don't see the British middle class anyhow as being very sympathetic towards what remains of the working class. What has happened is that the working class has become more middle class themselves. At least that's my view.
Before you respond to some of the points that have been raised, and then we'll open it up if there are questions, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I think, one of the things that I found very interesting and in some ways quite brave about Harsh's book is the countercurrent that it swims in the face of all the books about India that have come out in the last let's say 10 years, all the mammoth books, which all really focus somewhere up there and are not concerned with what's going on the ground. And I think it's quite interesting and quite brave to put together a book as wide-ranging as this, which really only focuses there. And the other thing interesting for me, again, personally, was that it's interesting to find a book like this. And when you compare it with all the other big India books that have come out, where there is not a single mention, line, awareness, or even sense about women in this country. You can look at India Grows at Night, or India Sleeps at Night, or Jo Bhi Sari Wo Kitabein Aa Rahi Hain. It's as if women don't exist. And there isn't, it's not only women, but it's also as if caste doesn't exist and the only thing that exists is the corporate world and so on. Whereas with Harsh's book, in some ways, it's woven into this awareness and presence of the marginalities is woven into the texture of the book, and I think that is something that's quite unusual. But Harsh, you've had both accolades and criticism. Maybe you'd like to respond a little bit too.
No, I think most of what is said, I completely agree. And I was wondering, how to respond. I'll say a few things, and one was, inspired by the story that Siddharth spoke of. Interacting with civil servants, and I go to the academy and I interact with them in many different capacities. I'm amazed at how much they have bought into the idea of the market and the changed role of the state, and how hostile they are. I mean, now, so just the story to start with, which is not in the book. The day the elections results, March 14th last year, were May 14th.
May 14th.
Yeah, the results were announced. So friends started ringing up, and after a point it became almost funny to me because people would ring up almost like condoling at death, like we're really sorry, and and this thing. And so after a point I started sort of finding it a little funny. Then one younger colleague from the IAS with whom I thought I had a very fond relationship rang up, and he said, today was the day I felt I must speak to you. And I said, thanks, it's so nice that you thought of ringing up and so on. And then he lunged into me, all knives bared. And he said, today I wanted to say to you that you are responsible, people like you are responsible for pulling this country back. We've lost 10 years and so on. And he said that you're stuck in some kind of time warp. You think that the poor, you're stuck in the 1950s and 60s. You think the poor are this group which wants to break stones, which wants cheap food, which wants to go into your substandard schools. India's changed beyond your furthest imagination. And then he talked about the land bill. He said the Land Acquisition Act that you wrote is not worth toilet paper, and so on and so forth. And he went on about half an hour. He kept speaking. At some point, I just said, I just wanted to ask you, why didn't you ring me up in 2009 and say, wow, poor people want to break stones? And he said, no, the 2009 elections had nothing to do with NREJ. It really had to do with people rewarding Manmohan Singh for the nuclear deal and for showing the left its place. So I said, okay. But, going to the academy, I get, very good, when I speak to young IAS officers, they're willing to listen to everything that I say. Once they're about 5-10 years into the service, they get more and more hostile to conversations of this kind. And I think that, why I think a focus on the middle class is so important is that the state is constituted by people of the middle class. And if they carry both prejudice and indifference and actually active hostility, what I've seen is that the state is not simply indifferent to the very, very poor. It's almost actively at war against them. So demolish, block, that they are somehow the problem. So we don't invest in agriculture. Poor people are running away from agriculture, coming into the cities. Once they come into the cities, they're not welcome here. They're not legitimate citizens. You don't build. The fact that we see homeless children every day, walking, coming to work and coming away, winter nights, the fact that we don't have a policy for dealing with this, to me, as I said, I've come here to this understanding pretty late in my own evolution of my thinking, that one can keep dreaming of the best policies in the world, and you might even be able to push them through some kind of stealth and so on. But they're not going to change people's lives if people who are responsible to implement them don't believe in them. And so that's why I think the normative framework became so important. That India will not change unless the middle class changes, or we have a revolution. I mean, and the middle class and there's no sign of it in the kind of politics that we've seen. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. Second, I totally agree that that what we're seeing is the outcome of neoliberal politics, and also, side by side, the whole war, global war on terror and the demonization of the Muslim is also a global phenomenon which we see the impact of. But I think, when did India change, and how did it change so profoundly? So I sometimes think of three demolitions which changed our world. One was the demolition of the Berlin Wall, which really, with it, was not the end of the most ambitious experiment to build a just and equal society. It was as if the ideas of justice and equality themselves were devalued forever, and that was one big change. Then, of course, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, with which the whole, the core sort of axiomatic belief that this country belongs equally to all somehow went. And then the demolition of the Twin Towers in the US, and with it, the legitimization of militarization, of targeting populations, of labeling, of terror laws, and all of that. And I think through all of this, India changed, and we see those impacts on the middle class. But I say somewhere in the book that the Indian middle class today represents three different normative frameworks which justify inequality. One is this new neoliberal idea, Reagan, Thatcher, that greed is good, what's wrong with earning money and spending it, and so on. Give up the socialist guilts of the past. But there is also the idea of caste, which we have, we might call it caste and not recognize it to be caste. But the idea that it is all right for the accident of a person's birth, for a child's birth, to determine everything about that person's life, whether she'll be able to study, how far she'll be able to study, what kind of work is open to her, what kind of work is not open to her, what her life will be, is almost 90% determined by the fact of her birth, and that hasn't changed. And thirdly is the British class system, which somehow says that, with wealth you have culture and refinement and so on. And so the neoliberal idea, the British idea, the class system, the caste system, all of these have converged in creating a particularly a middle class which is, I think, profoundly hostile to poor people and to minorities. And that has implications for the kind of government and the kind of politics we have. So I was thinking that. The last thing I just want to say was that I remember college, and one can perhaps be nostalgic as I've just turned 60, so you're growing older, and maybe you remember things with, rose-tinted classes. But my memory of college was that most of our conversations were around chipped sort of enamel coffee cups, around how we'll make the world better. Today, those conversations have disappeared. Today, most young people will be in fancy coffee houses discussing very different subjects from the kind that compelled us. And I think that, again, reflects a profound... So that's why I've come into the normative framework. And I think that it affects politics, the kind of state we have, the kind of way that we're raising our children, the failure of the common school system, all of that we've spoken about, somehow we have to accept culpability as the middle class for where India is today.